Everyone for joining us for this webinar today. It's great to see some familiar names and faces and also some people who I haven't met yet. Welcome. My name is Carragh Erhardt and I am the Program Coordinator for Sexuality and Inclusion here at the National Office of the Presbyterian Church in Canada. In my role, I work with all kinds of different ministries, committees, and departments of the Presbyterian Church to help the denomination to become more welcoming and inclusive for people of all genders and sexual orientations. So in this webinar, I'm going to guide us through an exploration of how we can begin to answer one of the most common questions that I get asked by ministry leaders, which is, how can I tell if my church is really inclusive? This question comes up in conversation with people from all kinds of different ministries with a variety of experiences and positions and opinions related to LGBTQI2+ inclusion. So the first step in answering that question is being able to describe what we mean by inclusion. So I'll start by offering a definition that I find helpful. We'll also talk about why it's important to be intentional about matters related to inclusion in a ministry context. And during that section of the webinar, I'll talk about some features of inclusive church cultures that are worth working towards. And then the third area of focus for the presentation will be tangible steps that we can take to put LGBTQI2+ inclusion into practice. As we get started, I will acknowledge that we're gathering online today from coast to coast, from lands that have held and continue to hold significance to hundreds of Indigenous nations. Personally, I'm working today on the traditional territory of the Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Anishinaabe, in an area that is part of Treaty 13, the 1805 Toronto Purchase Agreement, which is held by the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. The land I'm speaking from is also part of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum, an agreement between the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy to share the land and its resources so that there would always be enough to go around. In June 2024, the Presbyterian Church in Canada adopted an apology for our role in colonization and operating residential schools. This is a demonstration of the things that we have learned since we adopted our confession in 1994. In doing so, we apologize for our role in attempting to eliminate Indigenous identities, cultural and spiritual traditions, including Indigenous understandings of family, sexuality, and gender. We know that residential schools held strictly enforced expectations about gender and what it meant to be a good Christian boy or a good Christian girl, including the classes that students were taught and the labor that they were forced to do. At some of those schools, we also know that teachers and staff arranged marriages in order to prevent children from returning to their home communities. And often that had economic impacts as well as personal and community impacts. These are just a couple examples of the ways that gender, sexuality, culture, sovereignty, community all overlap. And part of the reason that the church is called to continue listening and telling the truth about the past is to make sure that we will continue working to support Indigenous-led healing and wellness initiatives, to stand in solidarity with Indigenous people and communities, to ensure that all people have access to their needs being met and their well-being. I'll encourage you, especially if you've got a pen and paper, to make a note to try, if you don't already know, to learn a little bit about the Indigenous nations on the land that you live on, and learn about their specific and unique understandings of gender and sexuality, and find out if there are any Two-Spirit or Indigenous LGBTQ organizations that are actively working on those healing efforts that you can support. Some quick guidance about how this webinar will go and how you can engage. As Grace already said, microphones are turned off for now, just to help us have a clean recording. And you can submit questions, though, at any time through either the Q&A function. Usually it's in the bottom of your Zoom screen. It might be under a button that says more. You'll see kind of this black Q&A button here that's on the screen. So you can use that, or if that's not available to you for some reason, you can use the chat and that will go to either Grace or I so that we can answer questions at the end of the presentation. Hoping to leave about 20 minutes or more so that we can get into aspects of this topic that matter most to you. Keep in mind as you're asking your questions, because I know you can ask throughout, that the webinar is being recorded. And so that's important for keeping questions general or hypothetical rather than including specific names. We also ask for this so that the questions are as broadly helpful as possible. For specific questions about specific situations, we can always set up a time to talk afterwards in a one-on-one way. I also like to remind folks to make sure that you're asking a question and not submitting a statement. You'll have a chance to submit feedback after the webinar as well. But for Q&A time, it really helps to keep us focused and let me know what you want to know if I'm receiving questions and not statements. They're just harder to respond to because it's often unclear what people are looking for. There are many acronyms that are used to describe individuals and groups who don't identify as heterosexual or straight and/or cisgender. And by cisgender, I mean people whose gender identity aligns with the sex or gender that they were assigned at birth. For the most part today, I'll be using LGBTQI2+, which stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, and two-spirit. And the plus sign indicates that this acronym is expansive and represents a variety of additional identities, even if they're not explicitly given a letter in that acronym. Some examples that are on the screen would be asexual or pansexual. I may also occasionally say queer and trans as an umbrella term or use a shorter iteration of that acronym. It's just for brevity. Know that regardless of what I'm saying, I'm talking about these groups as expansively as possible. I also want to say I often get questions about identity terms early in the webinar, but I will say for today, it's okay if you're not familiar with all of these terms. And that knowledge isn't a central part of what we'll be talking about today in the presentation. It's also not a prerequisite for what we'll be discussing. Mainly, that's because even with within just one of those identity groups, there's a wide variety of experiences, worldviews, and needs, which may not be reflected if we're describing just one definition. These identities can also be shaped by other factors like race, culture, socioeconomic class, geography. So for example, when I tell people that I identify as genderqueer, that only paints a general picture of what that means to me, more like an impressionist painting than a clear photograph. I will be happy though to answer any questions about words related to gender and sexuality during the Q&A time. But for now, I'd like to begin our conversation about what I mean when I talk about inclusion. The definition of inclusion that I turn to the most frequently comes from Lily Zhang, who's the diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant. Lily describes inclusion as the achievement of an environment that all stakeholders, especially underserved and marginalized populations, trust to be respectful and accountable. Inclusion is achieved through actions that explicitly counter present-day and historical inequities and meet the unique needs of all populations. The question, how do we know if we're really inclusive, tells me that people are looking for a way of measuring inclusion. And since congregations and other ministries in the Presbyterian Church in Canada come from many different contexts, representing a variety of needs, variety of experiences, I think it's important for us to conceptualize inclusion in a way that is sufficiently flexible while still being rooted in shared values among the denomination. So with that in mind, I appreciate that this definition focuses on achievement, not just aspirations. In Lily's book, they get a little more in depth about how you can actually measure some of these characteristics like trust. And we can talk about that a little in the Q&A as well. The other part of that is it helps us get more specific when asking the question, are we really inclusive? It opens the door, for example, to ask, do people trust that they will be treated with respect here and that their needs will be taken seriously? When we stumble and hurt one another, have we proven that we will be accountable and repair that harm to the best of our ability? I think these questions hold value for all Presbyterian congregations, regardless of their position on marriage or ordination. Also, this definition places emphasis on meeting the unique needs of all populations, which recognizes that our well-being is interconnected and reflects an ethic of collective care. The pushback that we often see to diversity, equity, and inclusion tends to be rooted in people's concern that another group's needs will be prioritized over their own. And so I think as we approach this work, we need to be very clear that while needs within a community of faith can seemingly compete with one another or any community, it isn't inevitable that one group's needs take precedence to the exclusion of everyone else's needs. This still is a general definition of inclusion, and later I'm going to adapt this definition to be more specific and demonstrate how you can apply different perspectives to this understanding of inclusion. But first, I want to stay in this realm of the general, and I want to talk about some characteristics of an inclusive church culture in that more general way. So when we ask, why is inclusion important? Why should it matter to churches? Why is it worth pursuing? There are three main features that come to mind for me. The first is that I think that inclusive church cultures help us to foster healthy relationships with God and with one another. Dr. Lisa Oakley, who is a psychologist lecturer, I think at the University of Chester, describes healthy church cultures as one where people are supported and empowered to come to their own conclusions rather than looking to a single leader for all the answers. Dr. Oakley's work is very focused on the topic of spiritual abuse and overcoming spiritual abuse and healing from that. And in her research has found that spiritual abuse is more likely to occur in situations that are authoritarian, where there is one leader who is seen as giving everyone all of the answers, who is guiding everything, and that healthier cultures tend to involve more leadership, more supervision and reflection and discernment together. And that when we develop this kind of environment, it actually gives us access to deeper and more full relationships, both with God and with one another. The second element of fostering healthy church relationships and healthy church environments is prioritizing the prevention of harm and repairing harm when it happens. This touches on the accountability piece of Lily's definition. Is there trust that when someone or a group within that church hurts somebody, as humans will do, that the community will be accountable in meeting the needs of the party that was harmed and facilitating repair? Can we see repentance and repair as a spiritual practice? Rabbi Danya Rettenberg's book is really great for some guidance on that if you want to think more about that topic. The third is that I think both of these previous ones feed into this as well, but focusing on centering respect, accountability, trust, and a responsiveness to the needs of unique groups enables churches to live more fully into our call to pursue justice, both in our own faith communities and in our wider communities and the world as broadly as possible. In Living Faith, which is one of the Presbyterian Church's doctrinal statements, we describe this as a call to create well-being in every society. Again, this reflects the understanding that all of our well-being is tied up with each other's. As many Black liberation theologists would say, like, we are not free unless all of us are free. And I think that when we foster the conditions for people to show up honestly and authentically, we have a better chance at gaining insight into the divine and how to take care of one another well. So I think these are just a few framings that you can use to start talking about why inclusion matters, or why taking an approach to inclusion that centers respect, accountability, and trust can be useful in a ministry context. Now that I've talked a bit about how to define inclusion and why inclusion matters, I'm going to share some of my tips for approaching work related to inclusion in a ministry context. These tips are relevant to matters of LGBTQI2+ inclusion, but they could be applied to other inclusion or justice topics like anti-racism work, climate justice work, or just disability justice and accessibility. The first tip is that context matters. There is no one-size-fits-all approach that works for every congregation or every ministry. So it's really helpful to consider, in addition to just your congregation's unique needs, what helps give your congregation or ministry a sense of shared identity? What are words, for example, that people use to describe your congregation in a positive way? Are there stories that people often share to paint a picture of the kind of community that you are together? How can these traits or stories support you in framing efforts to become more respectful and accountable as a congregation? What might contribute to authentic and lasting change in how the congregation takes care of one another and the broader community? Giving your congregation or other ministry a frame or sense of framing like this can help people be more invested in trying out new things and in pursuing this vision of inclusion together. My other main tip for starting, and this is key throughout as well, but is to tend to the foundation, especially at the beginning. One thing that I've observed and heard from congregations is that efforts to focus on including a particular group of perceived outsiders is that the timing matters pretty significantly. If a congregation is in a position of dealing with significant conflict about day-to-day ministry matters, an attempt to layer on something that people could write off as a special project or, again, meant to deal with an outsider community can exacerbate that conflict. And I want to be clear, conflict is not to be avoided at all costs, but the problem that I have seen is that when there's existing conflict and we layer on topics about including specific groups, it often gives people a sense of permission to scapegoat individuals and communities that are already marginalized and underserved in the church. That can be extremely painful and destructive for everyone involved. And so if that's a situation that you're starting from, and you're not alone, there are a lot of congregations that have had similar experiences, I really recommend that you work on building trust, respect, and accountability within your congregation and those immediate concerns first. When we work on tending to conflict and developing that healthier culture, that makes it easier to address these other levels of ministry concern. So some examples of what you might do in that case could be pursuing additional training in pastoral care or conflict resolution for the congregation's clergy and elders, or others in the congregation who are responsible for that kind of work. Preachers may decide to put some effort and more attention into preaching on how the early church handled disagreement and lessons that can be gleaned from those stories. Once people have a feeling that they are really being listened to and cared for, and that the general, more toxic conflict has been tended to, processes that focus on the needs of specific communities tend to be much less choppy. And I've seen this happen for congregations. So as much as timing can be a source of anxiety, it's worth tending to the foundations and doing this well. The third tip is to get curious and ask a lot of questions. In a general sense, what are the needs in our community? How do we meet them? Those are the two questions that I think all other questions flow from. You can ask, what have other congregations done that has been fruitful? How likely is what they've done to work for our context? At its core, I think that inclusion work is a commitment to ongoing discernment, curiosity, and reflecting on whether the things that we're trying are actually achieving the outcomes we're looking for. You can ask, we tried this thing, how did it go? What can we learn from it? What might we try differently in the future? It can be really helpful too in these periods of more focused discernment on a specific topic or inclusion of a certain group to be explicit with the congregation and say, as leaders, we are in a period of discernment. We'll be trying some new things. Some of them may feel comfortable, some may not, and we welcome your feedback throughout. We want to make sure that we're taking care of everyone as we do this. Think about feedback channels that make the most sense for your congregation. I'll be talking a bit more about this in a webinar on April 10th about how you prepare for those kinds of pastoral listening experiences as elders or other leaders in a congregation. So I welcome you to sign up for that webinar as well. But yeah, making sure that we have these clear containers and appropriate channels where people can both express support, but also express concern or dismay without it directly impacting other people in the congregation can be really important. The fourth tip here is to plan for sustainable pacing. I hear a lot from people that they're worried about their congregation moving either too slowly or too quickly, and anywhere in between. So pay attention to the response of your congregation as you engage in this work and try to find a balance of the pace that works best for their needs. Also, consider what feels sustainable to you and the other leaders in your congregation. While there can be some milestones like adopting a new policy or an updated policy, or developing a relationship with a community group that you previously weren't involved with, much more of developing an inclusive culture is establishing practices and approaches that will continue to need attention and intention to sustain them in the life of your ministry. In other words, there's no definitive finish line to race towards. So focus on making plans that are reasonable to achieve without burning yourselves out and that feel authentic and natural to the congregation, even if that means it's still more work. You don't want your congregation to feel that this is being forced upon them in an arbitrary way. The last on this list of tips for fostering inclusion is to adapt your plans as needed. Having a plan can be really helpful for keeping forward momentum and giving you a sense of direction. But if reasons arise that make that plan impossible or unadvisable, you can always adapt your plan. Remember, we're trying to answer these questions. What are the needs and how do we meet them? You don't need to stick to a plan that's not meeting the needs of your congregation. You can always pivot. Okay, so I said we would get more specific about defining LGBTQI2 plus inclusion. So let's consider this adapted definition. LGBTQI2 plus inclusion is the achievement of an environment that all stakeholders of all genders and sexual orientations, especially LGBTQI2 plus people, trust to be respectful and accountable. Inclusion is achieved through actions that explicitly counter present day and historical inequities and meet the unique needs of all populations. Again, notice that this definition still focuses on all stakeholders and meeting the unique needs of all populations. However, by adding explicit mention of gender, sexual orientation, and the specific needs of LGBTQI2 plus people, I've shifted the definition to help us ask more specific questions. And you could do this again with other marginalized and underserved groups within the church. It doesn't just have to be LGBTQI2 plus people, but this is one way to get more specific in what we're talking about. So some questions that you might ask, for example, would be, do trans people have sufficient evidence to trust that they will be respected if they visit your congregation? If a lesbian couple asks for you to baptize their child, how will you respond? If you receive a request from a same-sex or same-gender couple to host their wedding, but your congregation has not decided yet that they will do so or has decided that they won't, are you prepared to make a respectful referral to a congregation that would host the wedding? Another example would be to ask, how comfortable is your congregation with talking about sexual ethics and healthy relationships? Is that considered too taboo to approach, even in the context of heterosexual relationships? To expand on that example, I think it's important to note that when we make topics like this unspeakable, regardless of gender or sexual orientation, members of our congregations will seek answers about what Christians think about sex as if there's only one answer, and they will seek those answers from the loudest and most available voices to them. That was certainly my experience growing up in the Presbyterian Church. Recall that part of what Dr. Oakley describes as a healthy church culture is supporting one another to engage in discernment and draw our own conclusions. When we set certain topics like sex and gender aside as being too taboo, too controversial, or being a closed book, we don't just harm LGBTQI2 plus people, but we make it harder for people of all sexual orientations and gender identities to experience conversations about an important part of their embodied, emotional, and spiritual lives. When we focus on the needs of LGBTQI2 plus people, we can learn about what kinds of problems that creates, and we can discern ways of better meeting everyone's needs. Another way to think about that, or about this framing, is, at least one that comes to me, is that when Jesus talks about the last shall be first and the first shall be last, I don't think that means that inversion leaves out the first becoming the last. I think that means when we look at the needs of those who have been most marginalized, we learn about everyone's needs as well, and we can find creative ways of making sure that everyone's needs are met and not just tending to the few who have the most access to our spaces. When we get more specific about what congregations can do to specifically include LGBTQI2 plus people, I think it's important for us to have a conversation about what we mean by affirming ministries and what meaning that has within a Canadian context. Most people, when they hear about a church saying that it's affirming, will think, whether they know it or not, about the United Church process for congregations becoming affirming, or at least the standards that is set by that process. Affirm United is an organization within the United Church of Canada that for several decades has journeyed with congregations to become publicly, intentionally, and explicitly affirming of people of all genders and sexual orientations. So I'm going to just read off their description of what an affirming ministry is, and then we'll talk a little bit about signs of affirming ministries and what that would look like for a Presbyterian church. Affirm United describes affirming ministries as communities of faith that publicly declare their commitment to inclusion and justice for people of all sexual orientations and gender identities. Although affirming ministries make an explicit statement about issues of sexuality and gender, their commitment to justice is far broader. They continually grow and change as they seek to live more fully into God's way of welcome, love, and justice for all creation. So I mentioned that concept of being public, intentional, and explicit is a key part of the United Church of Canada and Affirm United's understanding of affirming ministries. What they mean by this is that it doesn't meet the threshold of being affirming if a congregation just says, maybe on their website, we welcome everyone. They want welcome statements that are more specific. So a welcome statement that says explicitly, we welcome people of all genders and sexual orientations. We welcome people of all family configurations. Those are the kinds of language that they're looking for. And so a welcome statement is one piece of the criteria for becoming designated as an affirming ministry. An inclusive marriage policy is another. In the Presbyterian Church in Canada, it's important to note that marriage policies are set by the session of a congregation. There's no obligation to do a congregational vote. And generally speaking, it's not advisable to do a congregational vote, since often congregations who do that are doing so before they've done sufficient exploration and discernment as a congregation, and it can lead to uncomfortable situations where perhaps the minister thought the vote would go one way and it goes the other way. Well, now what? What do you do? So session is able to have those conversations and make those decisions independently. That said, it's still good for conversations to happen between the session and members of the congregation so that the congregation is aware that the conversation is happening and can give their input. A session can also always decide, currently we are in one place. Maybe currently we're not prepared to define marriage as a relationship between two adults. But maybe we know we want to work towards that. We will hold off on changing until we've had more conversation and done more work with the congregation. Alternatively, like some sessions may be in a place where people hold strong opinions for either definition of marriage, that marriage is a covenant relationship between a man and a woman, or that marriage is a covenant relationship between two adults. In that case, they may say, oh, well, this is something we clearly need to talk about more in order to have more understanding of one another. And we don't know where this will take us, but we are committing to engaging in a process of discernment together. In the affirming ministries process, one of the third requirements is an ongoing plan for education and action. And this is especially important because, as I said earlier, there's no definitive finish line. If anything, for congregations that become affirming through this designation process, that's a milestone marker in the journey, but in many ways it's early in the journey. And there's a lot more work for congregations to continue once they've gained that designation. I wanted to give these examples of their criteria so that Presbyterian congregations are aware that if you describe yourselves as affirming, I think these are the 3 minimum expectations. It's not to say you can't say that you're affirming if you don't, but people may have expectations that you are not prepared to meet because you haven't done the legwork. It's important to note as well that most congregations who go through the Affirm United process do so in the period of about 1.5 to 2 years on average. So this isn't a quick decision, it's not overnight, and takes a lot of time, intention, and being really clear about the work that you're doing and why. With those criteria in mind, I wanted to give a few more examples about ways that anyone can be involved in pursuing LGBTQI2+ inclusion within their congregation. And again, I would say, generally speaking, any congregation could take up some or all of these things, regardless of their position on marriage and their official policy. So the first is to resist making assumptions about people, about theology, about God, and again, to embrace curiosity. In some ways, it feels like the church has been talking about sexuality for decades, and in other ways, I think a lot of congregations feel still unprepared or unsure about how to have these conversations. So taking time to equip yourselves, resisting the idea that you have or need to have all the answers right away is one piece of the puzzle, I think. I think it also benefits the church to find myriad ways of learning from LGBTQI2+ people. So whether you have a formal leadership role in your congregation or not, you may decide to bridge gaps in your own knowledge if you have them. And for some people who may say, I don't really know anyone close to me in my personal life who is LGBTQ, or I don't really know what queer and trans people in my community are concerned about or interested in. The good news is that there are lots of opportunities to learn. The internet is vast, so keep in mind the quality of your sources as you're browsing the internet. But I encourage folks to do a lot of looking for local events as well, and local community organizations. In many cities and in some towns, there will be regular events like book signings and talks from LGBTQ authors. If you really enjoy reading novels, there are plenty of queer and trans authors that you can be looking for and reading their work. Memoirs and nonfiction are also great options to be learning. If there's an art exhibit near you that's focusing on queer and trans artists, that's a way that you can start to learn more about LGBTQI2+ people. Also, reading through parts or all of Rainbow Communion's report or watching their video titled Not All Are Welcome is a great way to hear specifically from LGBTQI2 plus people connected with the Presbyterian Church and from their family members and other people who shared their stories. The third point here is to think about ways that you can address disrespectful jokes and comments. Like inclusion generally, there's no one-size-fits-all approach for how we address these moments. You can address disrespectful or harassing comments in any number of ways, and generally you want to aim for something that's proportional to the situation. One of my favorite pieces of advice is that if someone tells a joke that is homophobic or transphobic, you can ask them to explain it. Just don't laugh and say, "Oh, I don't get it." and then they have to either double down on what they're talking about and you can open that conversation more, or they'll say, "Oh," and kind of backtrack, right? You also want to keep in mind in these moments, who are the people being harmed? If this is a conversation that's one-on-one between two straight people, two cisgender people, you can maybe address things more directly and don't worry so much. But if there are LGBTQ people in the room or involved in the conversation, they may not appreciate having a direct response in that moment, but might appreciate a check-in afterwards. There are organizations like Right to Be that offer bystander intervention training that might be really helpful to think about if you feel uncomfortable or unprepared to intervene in moments that are disrespectful, harassing, harmful. And so far, while these things have been available to anyone in the PCC, regardless of whether you have a formal leadership role or not, and I do really believe that there's work that all of us can contribute to. This last point is for people that do have some sense of formal leadership role in a congregation. So consider what tasks you're responsible for and how LGBTQI2 plus inclusion fits into that role. So for example, if you are involved in planning and facilitating Christian education, reviewing the curriculum that you use or the curriculum that you're considering, and ask yourself how it talks about gender, sexuality, or LGBTQ people. Obviously, if this is Christian education for children, how is that being done in an age-appropriate way? Does it mention those subjects negatively, positively? Not at all. I would generally say avoid ones that have an overtly negative position, particularly if it is one that could support violence against LGBTQ people. But otherwise, I think there's some leeway of, well, are you looking for curriculum that talks about this, or will you plan other opportunities to talk about gender and sexuality, again, in ways that are appropriate to your audience and leave room for conversation and nuance? Another example would be that if you're responsible for maintaining your congregation's website, you can look at whether the website has any information about what LGBTQ people can expect in terms of how they'll be treated if they visit your church. This ties back into that conversation about being public, intentional, and explicit. So starting from a baseline of the Presbyterian Church has committed to respecting LGBTQ people and repairing harm. That might be something that goes on your website. The main reason for this is to make sure that people have the information that they need to decide how involved they might want to be participating in your ministry based on their specific needs. So having a clear wedding policy can be really helpful. Having explicit mention on a welcome statement of LGBTQ people if you've done the work to feel comfortable and confident that that would be true. And another option, if you, again, are in that discernment phase and you don't know what your wedding policy might look like in the next 2 years, it's fair to say that on your website too. Any information that people can find readily available is useful in helping them make decisions. That brings us to the end of the presentation segment. So we've got about 15 to 20 minutes for questions and answers. I'm going to try to find where those controls are for me so I can see what questions have come through, if any, so far. Okie doke. I have these the different chat and question boxes open. So if anyone has questions, feel free to send those along. In the meantime, I'm going to sip some water. I'm seeing the hand raise function from Knox Red Deer. Grace, would you mind unmuting them?
Okay. Hi, Knox. You can go ahead and unmute yourself. Thank you.
Hasn't speaking yet.
Can you, okay. Do you have samples of information that would go on websites or in documents? How is it expressed?
Yeah, so I think it depends on what you are hoping to express and what specifically you can provide in terms of information. I'd be happy to pull a couple samples together and connect with you directly to see what you're working on. If it's a situation where you've updated your wedding policy, I've definitely got some examples of those that I could forward along. And I think there's any number of different ways that congregations express in a welcome statement what their position is and how they go about that. Did you have more of a specific question with that, or does that sound helpful?
I think the welcome is where we're at for sure at this point.
Mm-hmm.
But it would be good to see the updated wedding information just
Mm-hmm.
so that we can start looking at how we manage that as a congregation and as a session.
Sure, absolutely. And the clerks of assembly in 2021, after the remits were adopted, did produce a resource that covers some of what I described about session decisions, how you make those decisions, and has a sample wedding policy. So we can make sure to include that in the follow-up email.
That would be excellent. Thank you.
Great, good question. Okay, I'm seeing a question here that says, we are a rural church in Ontario. We are a very welcoming church and would like to become more inclusive. Where do we start? It's a good question and also a tough one. As I said, this work is very contextual. So I think the question might be to ask how inclusive are we? And again, honing in on that definition. For those who are already connected with your congregation and part of your congregation, how much do people trust that level of respect and accountability is where you want it to be? One way to measure trust, for example, is thinking about, do people express disagreement when they have it? Will people openly express opinions? Could be about this topic, could be about other topics. And if they do, how well is disagreement handled? So that can be a starting point. Another starting point might be to, if you're on session, bring this up in a session meeting and say, we've talked about wanting to do this. What are some initial questions? And without looking for answers, brainstorm a big long list of questions. And then choose what are the questions that you most feel ready to answer or ready to start looking for answers. So some examples of questions might be, what supports do LGBTQI2+ people need in terms of pastoral care? And then you might look for books or resources about pastoral care resources. And you might even assign those out to different people on session and say, okay, great. Grace is responsible for reading this book and Carragh is responsible for reading that book. They'll report back at the next meeting with some information that they've gleaned. And then we can do some discerning together about what we might want to do with that information. Is that helpful? That's more about like process than specific questions or specific actions. Yeah, great. Okay, so there's a question that came in through the chat that says, with the acronym LGBTQI2+, does that plus include the Two-Spirit? And is that generally accepted reference to include Two-Spirit? It's a really good question. So the acronym LGBTQI2+ is the version that the government of Canada used to use. I think they've since updated to move 2S for Two-Spirit in front of the acronym. This is one of the like kind of uncomfortable decisions I've made in the course of this work is how do I balance the need to recognize Two-Spirit people while also trying to create resources for people with a range of prior experience and knowledge about Two-Spirit, queer, and trans communities. So in 2017, when Rainbow Communion started their work, the accepted acronym from the denomination, or the most commonly used one, was LGBTQI for lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, and intersex. When I started this position in 2020, it was important to me that we add Two-Spirit in, which is where the two comes in towards the end of the acronym. And I weighed whether that would be a decision to put at the front or go with the end position. It might change over time. I think people are more familiar with language now, but that's the decision I've made for the time being. Depending on the context, sometimes I'll do presentations where I say 2S LGBTQIA+. It really depends on my assessment of whether that will create overwhelm. And again, I try to balance that by being explicit about the needs of Two-Spirit people in land acknowledgements. I'm always open to feedback and talking about how I make those decisions and whether those decisions should be changed. But that's the rationale. We still have some time. If I don't see any more questions right now, I think I'm going to ask all of you a question that you can feel free to respond to or not. I'm always curious about how the definition of inclusion that I offer in this presentation lands with people. So if you're willing to share in the chat, on a range of 1 to 5, 1 being, this doesn't make sense to me, I don't think it works, to 5 being, this is very clarifying, and I think I could better understand this concept and explain this concept to other people. Ranking it 1 to 5. And that chat will just go to Grace and I, and then I'll share back what I see in the chat. I'm seeing some numbers coming in so far. And in the spirit of principled disagreement, anyone is welcome to say a 1, and I would love to hear what you think. But so far I'm seeing some 5s and a 4. Great. There's an added comment here as well. Oh, that's a great question. Someone's asked if I can reshare the slide with the definition of inclusion. Absolutely. Let's do that. Great. I'm putting up the general definition, but we can always shift to the other one as well. Great. Some more 5s and 4s. One comment that we received here was that the definition was helpful and tangible, especially once the word accountable was defined. So I think I'll explain a little bit more about accountability too. I mentioned Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg. Her book on repentance and repair, to me, has been really helpful in informing the ways I think about repentance and repair as a process, and the various stages of that. And one of the things that she says about accountability is that accountability is an internally driven like sensibility towards wanting to make things right, rather than punishment, which is an externally enforced approach to making things right. Yeah, okay. We've had a couple more questions come in the meantime, so I'll pivot to those. First one I'm seeing here is, has there been any talk about developing a more formal affirming process in the PCC? It's something that we've talked about a little bit within the office, and we'll be talking about with some committees coming up. There are a number of, I think, procedural questions about what that would look like. For example, if a congregation goes through the affirming process or an affirming process, and then later down the line, maybe hires a minister that wouldn't perform a wedding for a same-sex couple, is that designation revoked? What happens, right? While clearly I have a bias saying that this is important work for the church, it's only one piece of the church's ministry. And so there may be reasons for congregations to hire someone that would have a different position than the session. And so there's some questions about that. There's also questions about who gets to decide and through what authority would they get to decide who's met the standard of being affirming. So those are questions we want to talk about. And if an affirming process isn't something that makes sense for a Presbyterian context, then what does instead? Hopefully that's answered that question. I'm going to scroll back up and see a couple of the other questions here. Okay. A question is how to be open to or about the fact that even when some or many are for inclusion, there may be a few or even 1 or 2 who are not and might not make the environment fully safe for all. This is a great question. I hear this one a lot too, that, we think most people are in a similar position and place, and other people, like there might be a couple of people who are very vocally opposed to that. And I think there are a few answers to that question. The first being, you can have some one-on-one conversations with the people who are most opposed, try to get a better sense of their opposition and where that comes from. See if there's opportunity to find common ground. Sometimes people who are strongly opposed don't have all of the information about how decisions in the church have been made. And so providing clear, accurate information about the denomination's process can be useful. In some situations, I think it's also pastoral and gracious and fair to speak with the people who are the most vocally opposed. And once you've done some of that exploration of where their opposition is coming from, explaining how the decisions were made, and explaining what the denomination, what your congregation's ministry would look like if it were to become more LGBTQ inclusive. If you are still reaching a stalemate, or there's still strong opposition, I think it is fair and pastoral and gracious to ask whether that person is considering moving to a different congregation, and to express, grief, sadness, of course. I'm sure those are relationships that have been built over a long period of time. But I think our hope for the church is that people are finding congregations where their needs are met as best as possible. And if that person discerns that your congregation is no longer meeting their needs because of the direction it's heading, that is and can be a very sad experience, but sometimes can lead to better things for that person. But it's a tough question. All right, I'm going to break my guideline and respond to a statement, but let's see if I can phrase it as a question. The statement says, "I'm not sure I think that respectful and accountable are sufficient, although they are important. I think explicit, specific affirmation is important, as in the difference between being merely tolerated and being loved." So I think the question implied there is, what role does talking about being respectful and accountable have in service of potentially a goal for all Presbyterian congregations to be affirming? In part, I think we have to acknowledge what our current context is, and the fact that the denomination has two definitions of marriage means that people do have liberty of conscience over that. And I've resisted the idea of seeing one as being better than the other, in part because, again, that is what our denomination's position is, but also because I know that there are LGBTQ people in all kinds of congregations for all kinds of reasons. For some, their theological position may be more in alignment with the understanding that marriage is a covenant relationship between a man and a woman. And who am I to tell them that they can't believe that? I think that by being in relationship with congregations who maybe have different positions from one another, there's also opportunity for people who maybe are kids or teens growing up in congregations that are not affirming, to hopefully have access to and interaction with congregations of a different position, right? I think it's important that at minimum, congregations who affirm marriage as a relationship between, who affirm marriage as a covenant relationship between a man and a woman, that they acknowledge that there are Christians who also faithfully believe that marriage is a covenant relationship between two adults. So that's the goal for me, has always been, how do we move the floor up for everyone rather than create a process that only some congregations would find relevant to them. Just seeing slides here. Okay, I see the new question now. This person says, a huge part of the problem is biblical interpretation. People latch onto clobber passages, so to translate for people, the passages that most commonly are used to condemn homosexuality. In 40 years of ministry, I could never figure out how to move people beyond that. Any ideas? So my first idea among that is we can't change people. There's no guarantee of that. My other response to that is because people focus so much on those passages, I think we miss out on opportunities to listen to what queer and trans people and two-spirit people think about biblical interpretation in the rest of the Bible. So I would say start from a position where the goal is not consensus, but the goal is respectful conversation and making space for people to approach other passages of the Bible and show what they can glean from those and what they find that is life-giving in those passages. Okay, I'm just doing a quick perusal and seeing if there's anything else. I think we've already hit 2 o'clock. So if anyone needs to be signing off, thank you for coming and you're welcome to do so. Let's just see if there's any more questions that we want to finish off with. This is a good question. Is it okay to teach about inclusion as something we aspire to for many different people groups? Or does that water down the importance of particular inclusion efforts? This is a really good question. My personal opinion on this is that we strengthen inclusion efforts when we talk about as many groups as possible. There will be moments, of course, where you do want to be specific. And, it might be the case that a congregation says, we are approaching questions of inclusion with a few specific groups in mind, whether that's LGBTQ people, people who have been excluded, disrespected because of their racial or ethnic background, and people with disabilities. Like those often come up. So it might be a matter of putting those kind of at the center and saying, these are some of the lenses that we're approaching. These are some of the people who we are seeking to learn more from, because we know that we haven't historically. But anything that we can do, again, to remind people that our well-being is all connected, and that systems of oppression are also interconnected, requires responses of solidarity and making connections between the impacts of those systems. So sometimes I think you need to be careful, depending on like the specifics, and I would be cautious about making like one-to-one comparisons necessarily. But in general, I think encouraging people to draw connections between how racism, homophobia, transphobia, sexism, ableism all interact with one another, I think is useful. And part of that is to say, it might be saying as a community, we want to do this as well as we can. And that might mean that we move more slowly, but if we're doing so in a way that like builds coalition and builds solidarities, maybe that's in service of a greater result. Okay, I think I just see one more question. Yeah, similar vein of question, I think. So if I'm understanding the question right, do you think that this is working towards peace amongst as many people as possible? Having multiple definitions may be more conducive to people getting along instead of having one way that everyone has to subscribe to. And yeah, I think that gets at my point a little bit, or the goals that I've been trying to reach with this approach. In part, it's how do we meet people where they're at, right? How do we acknowledge what is while also hoping for and working on discerning a shared vision of what could be, right? Yeah, and I think it also meets the realization of we're all in different contexts, right? Different communities have different needs, goals, wants for all kinds of reasons. And having a path that's overly determined, I think, can become frustrating. So again, how do we create healthier cultures by giving people processes and tools that allow them to, again, become more respectful and accountable, to become more affirming if they're so called, and yeah, what can we learn from each other in the process? I think the other thing I will end on from that is that the word peace jumps out. And I think important to note that our understanding of peace isn't just an absence of conflict, but is the existence of well-being and dignity and respect for everyone. In part, I've approached this work as a queer person by asking myself, what about the way that we arrived at the decisions that the denomination has reached was painful, was needlessly cruel in some cases, and how do we make better decisions in healthier ways going forward? So I often think about this work from the standpoint of, what is it that I would hope people I disagree with could extend to me that would help me have a more fruitful faith life and connection with faith communities? Can I extend the same to them? And I know that that will not seem like enough for some people. And also it's the way that I think we move through this is giving one another, again, the agency and autonomy to read scripture, the tools to read scripture well, and to have respectful conversations, even as we disagree, and to say, you may land at a different conclusion than me. I can be okay with that if you're okay with that. And if you trust that my relationship with God is my relationship with God, and I'm working on that, I will trust the same for you. That's more or less how I think about this stuff. And I think that that gives us more room to maneuver than what I observed for a long time, which was expecting people to have fully formed, fully discerned opinions, either clearly in one place or clearly in another. I think especially in a congregational context, you're dealing with many people. So you're going to have people from across that spectrum pretending that there are only two positions of only for or only against. I think stymies conversation. So giving ourselves the permission to be honest is important. Great. I think we've passed over time. Oh, yeah, for sure. And I think that we've gotten through most of the questions. So I will just quickly put up my contact information. And invite anyone, if you have further questions, to reach out. We will be sending the recording to this when it's available. And I know we spoke about the wedding policy resource, so I'll send that in that email as well, along with a couple other links to helpful resources. You're welcome to reach out anytime, again, with questions. If you have specific situations that you're working through that you want someone to be a thought partner with, And yeah, also happy to tailor this kind of workshop to a congregational setting or a presbytery or anywhere else. And yeah, I hope that you all have a great day, and hopefully I'll see some of you again on April 10th. Thanks, everyone.